Welcome, thinkers, to Season 4, Episode 25, the final episode of this season of Thinking Critically, a D&D discussion. To be honest, I've had nothing planned for this finale or post-finale session. Usually I do something a little bit special, but this time I've got nothing. One thing I did think about doing was perhaps another Ask Me Anything kind of deal, a bit like we did at the end of Season 1, the Season 1 wrap-up, Episode 26 in a way. If you want to go and check that out, there's a flavour for what it can be like in there. But it's been a long time since I've done anything like that, or had just me talking for a length of time, which I know is everybody's absolutely favourite thing. So if that's something you fancy, come and drop me a question on Instagram, Twitter, DMs, email, on the website, thinkingcritically.co.uk. There's a message form on there as well. Or perhaps in Spotify, there's a way to do these things as well. So go and check out the Spotify. If you're listening on there, there should be a poll or something under the episode. Go and check that out. But yeah, otherwise, ask me anything, I guess, and we'll see if I can spin this into an episode at some point in the next couple of weeks. But otherwise, all the usual calls to action. No airs or graces with me. Rate the podcast on Spotify or Apple, please. That makes my life better, objectively. Pop a review if you've got 5 minutes. Or just listen is number one. Just have a listen. Tell me what works. Tell me what doesn't work. Tell me what I want to hear more of, or hear less of, indeed. Tell me what guests you want to hear back, perhaps. Or if you want to be a guest, please drop me a message as well. Otherwise, yeah, head to thinkingcritically.co.uk or my socials that are on the screen right now at thinkcritdnd. And of course, check out me playing the inimitable Quinn in Dungeons, Dice and Dudes at ddndpod on all the socials. Otherwise, let's get on with the show. And today I'm joined once again by Philippa Mort. Thank you ever so much for joining us again today, Philippa. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, thanks for having me back. My name's Philippa Mort. I am a TTRPG writer, adventure designer. I do a bit of art, and I also talk about a lot of TTRPGs of varying types on my TikTok channel as well. I kind of dabble in a lot of different things. That's me, basically, doing a bit of everything. A jack of all trades.
That reminds me that the TikTok thing, I think you will actually, this is completely sincere. This isn't, pre-produced anything. You're one of the first people, like the TTRPG creators that I saw was doing a TikTok, and I was like, is that, I had a look and was like, God, that's good. Do I need to be doing that?
Yeah, I hopped on the trend early.
Yes, no, absolutely. So yes, that's fantastic. And of course, regular listeners of the show will know that Philip has been on before, and we just worked out Season 2, right?
Long time ago.
Yes, back in 2021 for the episode on aesthetic. So please go and check out that one for part 1 of Philippa's time on the show. However, today's topic is experimenting. So what does that mean to you in the D&D and wider TTRPG framework?
So I was thinking about this, obviously, before I came on, and I feel like you can kind of break it down into a couple of different things. So, like, you've got experimenting within the game you're already playing, like D&D. So, like, the style of how you play you might experiment with, or, like, the tone of the game you're playing and, like, experimenting within the game. Maybe experimenting with how you use the rules and, like, changing mechanics to suit you. But also, I think you could look at experimenting as, like, bringing in lots of things from lots of different games to best suit you and your group, and experimenting beyond like what game you normally play. So if you normally play D&D, maybe you experiment and try something a bit different as well. I feel like that's the sort of two main areas I think of when I think of experimenting. Is either within one game or among games, I suppose.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And of course, my experience is somewhat limited. I have tried several TTRPGs, but obviously my bread and butter, my weekly games are all D&D 5e. So let's start somewhere around there then. I wanted to focus a little bit on my initial take on it was, obviously got two kinds of players most given tables. You have the games master and you have the players. And I think experimenting means very different things to those
Yes,
two
for
groups,
sure.
I think, regardless of the system. So I am a DM by, cut me and I bleed challenge rating.
Yeah.
And when I'm a player, I'm just turn my brain off and enjoy the game. So if we start there, then firstly, have you run many games? Let's put it like that. Let's go from there.
Yes. Yes.
That's probably a redundant question
I've
at this
been
point.
just to go over the background for context. I've been playing 10 or so years at least since I was at university, and then I've been GMing. I think 2019. I think just before the start of lockdown and things, I was kind of starting to GM, and then I did like a massive campaign like in 2020 when we had nothing else to do, and now I GM like. I'm mostly GM now. So I've kind of been on both sides, but I still play quite a lot as well. So I kind of get to do both sides of it, which is nice.
So in the games you've run, have you tried different, let's say, themes or to be cliche aesthetics, if you wanted to have a throwback? But yeah, so what I'm getting at is obviously there are several different ways to play or themed campaigns. Even within the published material, you've got goofy high school, Buffy the Vampire Slayer stuff, all the way to like cosmic horror and just straight horror, and then like the crippling loneliness of Frost Maiden and that kind of stuff. So if, say, you are a newer DM or have only done very kind of traditional or typical fantasy settings, what's the best way to dip your toe in those other settings, or to try and bring in maybe elements or themes from other ways to play while still kind of, this is the thing that I'm probably going to come back to quite a lot, is while remaining true to the game that you're playing or to who you are as a person.
No, I know what you mean. Yeah, like, well, like to ask it back to you, like, what if we're saying like trad style or traditional style of playing? What does that mean? Like, we're sort of leaning with high fantasy and maybe quite a lot of combat and things. So
yeah, like Minds of Phandelver and that kind of,
so
just
like,
run rate.
Yeah, how do we sort of experiment beyond that if we want to? Yeah, I feel like one of the good ways you can do it is exploring with setting. So I've actually been playing an Eberron game recently. Eberron's like, they say it's not magic punk, it's not steampunk, but it kind of is, but not fully. But it's got like a whole really in-depth setting of its own, and it's completely different from like sort of traditional Faerun setting in a lot of the ways that it plays, and it's got a lot of in-depth lore that you can then like look up on its little Wikipedia and things, and that has lent itself very well to playing with genre and things because it's kind of designed to do that. So like Eberron has like a lot of different regions. So there's like Kabara, which is this sort of like very good for cowboy sort of games, but then there's like these big cities which are good for sort of noir, and like there's pirates, so there's swashbuckling. So like I think experimenting with some of the other official settings is quite a good place to kind of start, or adding in a little bit of your own setting to the official setting if you're starting out with the books. So like another campaign I did, I just made a little town and then kind of like slotted it in somewhere because I didn't feel confident making a whole homebrewed world straight off. So I just did like one village is fine.
I have played in an Eberron setting before, and I think I always have had Warforged in for the first 70 sessions of my game, and so I had to do a little bit of homework to kind of bring myself up to speed on what they are before they came into my otherwise trad fantasy setting. But to me it is electric trains. I'm super stoked that you're now like there's all these other bits I wasn't even aware of. There's I want to do a Western in Eberron now. That sounds so cool.
my campaign, we are exploring everything because we're doing around Eberron in 80 days. So a Jules Verne themed travel campaign, which also I'd say experimenting with like, do you stay in the same location or do you travel around, is another way to kind of, you can bring in elements of different styles just by having your like group go to a different city and experiment like with just what if, for example, that city is just full of Leonin and then it's totally different to just a city that's full of human like traditional humanoids or whatever. So that's another fun way to kind of, I think, explore that.
Here's a related question that's just come to me. Now, I am very torn on what I'm about to say of what side I fall on to this thing here,
Okay.
because it's either very high risk or very low risk when you want to, as a GM, experiment with that kind of stuff. It's like,
Yes.
do I commit now to doing this weird and wacky thing, or taking the players over here? And it might be horrible, and maybe no one has a fun time, and this, that, and the other.
Are we stuck?
Yeah, or is it like everyone's kind of still there to have fun, and you don't need to worry about it, and if it doesn't work, you can move on? And I'm like, oh god, the risk adverse person in me is like is like shuddering at the thought of just pulling that band-aid off. But how do you feel about those thought processes that certainly I've gone through, and I imagine other DMs have gone through, when it's like, oh, is this thing a bit off piece? Is this going to be okay? Am I going to ruin the game? How do you feel about like that thought process?
I personally, this isn't something I struggle with, because I add weird, wacky stuff to my game all the time, so it's kind of the norm, and therefore is not weird anymore. But I kind of see where you're coming from, of like taking a risk with the tone of the campaign.
Yeah.
I always say, like, you need to talk with your group a lot, like out of character, and be like, hey, if you're worried about it, you could be like, how do you feel about if we try it for one session? And if we don't like it, it can always have been, you got sucked into the Fey rune and it was different, or Feywild, or you could just be like, it was a dream. If you decided you didn't like it. So like, there's ways to kind of make it less like concrete if you try it and then you're like, oh no, that really didn't work.
I was lucky in one previous case where the nature of my long form campaign, we just streamed session 97 the other night. Every time we stream, I'm like, this is the 100th one, right? Nope, we're still going, like, powering through the 90s. Soon it'll be session 100, and then we'll celebrate somehow. But anyway, that campaign is all, modular is not the right word, compartmentalized, very clean cut chapters. Regular listeners of the show, there's every kind of MacGuffin the players are after has a very clear beginning, middle, and end, and a theme beyond it. Pros, I've had loads of opportunity to experiment with a whole bunch of different weird things that are very kind of self-contained. Cons, we're almost at 100 sessions. We're like maybe halfway through.
Yeah.
So long form, to say the least. But because I had these ideas that are kind of modular now, because you can kind of pick up and transpose them into another setting, because they're all kind of independent to the wider piece. You can exchange my MacGuffin for a big pile of gold, and it works pretty much anywhere else. I found myself in a case where two of the newer players I was with, it was just the three of us were available on a given day, and they wanted to play D&D, and I was like, hey, do you know what, I'll attempt to run through one of these chapters, these modules. Fool, naive young DM Danilo thought one afternoon would do that, and now 5 chapters in, when none were less than 10 sessions, realized now that's a very stupid thing to have assumed. But that was what I'm getting at, is that was a good opportunity for me there to be like, let me try. It's very low risk, because the guys are just turned up. They're kind of aware that this is something is a bit half baked at the moment, because that's something I want to do in maybe 3 years' time. But it's got a nugget of a cool idea here. That example was City of Brass, Plane of Fire. I was like, that sounds like a cool setting, because it was alien in that it's a completely different plane that's always on fire and very uncomfortable, but still like, there's buildings, there's people walking around, there's shops, there's businesses, there's guard, that kind of stuff. So that was okay. It was very valuable for me. The players probably were like, okay, that was 4 hours where not a huge amount happened, because we got halfway through and then it's over. But that was one thing that I did that was a success. If you're fortunate enough to have people who are willing to take that journey with you from a games master's perspective, and to be like, yeah, let's run through this transparently experimental thing that the GM wants to run, then do it, go for it. Because obviously I think with many things in life, you learn best by doing, and I think giving it a dry run is probably the best thing to do. That was just one example I wanted to share with how I've managed to do that. And also part running the campaign maybe 2 times at this point. I've had a couple of first passes at a couple of those early chapters. However, now I'm very much in the first iteration of them, but it's now I've got the experience to paste over the cracks. The players don't know it's the first iteration, despite all the errors that may occur.
Yes. Well, I feel like something that I've kind of learned the more I GM is like the players don't know if you've messed up unless you say you've messed up a lot of the time.
Mhm.
Like nothing that you've planned is going to be real in the game until you've like said it into the game. So if you have to completely change what you're doing or you do a massive pivot, no one has to know about it unless
Yes.
you want to share it. So like I think a lot of like anxiety that I used to get as a newer GM, it's much less now because it's like, well, I can just change it and it's fine, because not only am I making the world up as GM, but then actually my players are shaping it so much anyway. It's going to be different from what I was trying to do in the first place, just through us interacting. Like that's the nature of role playing. So to bring it back to what we're talking about, like experimenting, I feel like even if maybe because we're sort of talking about, oh, well, we'll just talk with our group and it'll be easy peasy. I know some people find that a bit more difficult, but I think you can still do little experiments. You don't even have to mention you're doing it if you are worried about that. And just give it a go and just see what happens. And you can always be like, maybe not, and just do a quiet change.
Yes, a little retcon.
Yeah, just a little twiddle.
Absolutely. That is one thing that I learned as well quite quickly, is that you can get away with way more than you might feel like you can on the initial pass. Like you think you're being scrutinized with a magnifying glass, whereas in reality, one guy's knackered after a day of work, another player's on their phone, the other one's doing some online shopping. Like then, that you've got a lot of wiggle room to change. That prime example happened literally in the game last night. They're in a Dragonborn settlement. Up until this point, only like 2 Dragonborn had spoken Common, and the rest were speaking Draconic because that's their native tongue, and so there was obviously a bit of a language barrier, which engendered itself to some interesting roleplay scenarios. The warlock wanted to cast Suggestion, and technically for rules as written, the recipient, the target, has to understand. You can't just be talking gibberish. And that completely slipped my mind, and I was like, yeah, okay, roll. Okay, the NPC fails. I suggest you lead us to the treasure for sake of argument. And he was like, oh yeah, okay. And then it wasn't until like an hour later I was thinking, ooh, okay, this one just speaks Common now, and but no one knew. That's the point. Like, it was
this
like,
one had
that one speaks
lessons
Common
in Common at Dragon School. It's all fine.
Exactly. And no one batted an eyelid. I was just like, oh yeah, this one understood what you meant, and that was it. And no one was like, well, everyone should only speak Draconic. So it's that, and that was. Maybe I should start playing poker, because I'm just way better at poker facing things like that. I'm just like, yeah, that one's completely intended. That was the one that can understand
definitely
you,
meant
and
to do that.
exactly. You can get away with so much more. So I guess for those, as you said, for those little things, or settlements, or like let's try zany NPC, absolutely just have the confidence to drop them in, because the very worst case, they never get seen again, or you never go there again, and the players never knew that you were trying something new, and it's fine. And it was a thing that happened in the same way that half the rest of the game is just things that happen, 90% of which are just unimportant.
Yeah. I suppose that makes me think about, okay, what happens when we want to do a bigger experiment, though? Because obviously you were saying, like City of Brass, we can just kind of, as we're saying, we can link it to the game itself. But sometimes I think it's valuable to be like, I want to experiment quite majorly with the game in some way, setting or tone or whatever. I think it can be valuable to just be like, hey, why don't we just do like a one shot, or even a 3 or 4-parter to try something different, and then you could always work it in, because sometimes the change is so great. Say for example you wanted to do something completely different, like draw on Dimension 20s sort of like modern settings, or you wanted to do a Victoriana theme setting in D&D. That would take a massive change and would probably require you altering some of like the mechanics and things. So that obviously is a bit of a bigger change. Have you ever done anything like that?
Yeah, so the one I go back to, and this is probably the biggest departure from core D&D that I've had in the campaign. And again, I'm very lucky. I'm repeating myself, but I'm very lucky that the players were willing to take this journey with me. I'd given them a heads up. I'd said, I'm trying something new. It might suck, but it's ultimately just one kind of chapter. We'll go through it. I can kind of adjust on the fly if I need to, but it is quite different to the last 50 sessions we've been playing. So just kind of meet me halfway, meet me in the middle. The difficulty is, I don't want to spoil it for them. I don't want to be like, here's what I've got planned and here's what I'm trying to achieve. So I was trying to dancing around the topic of like, just trust me, please. Which as I said, I've hopefully built some of that trust. Hopefully built some of that trust over the 3 years I've been playing with these guys. But that was my time loop thing. As I said, regular listeners to the show, I go back to it quite a lot. But I wanted to build the feeling of games like Outer Wilds, one of my favorite games of all time. There's a time loop. Yeah. I wanted to really build that feeling of the knowledge and information is your weapon, and you build it up in the kind of constraints of a time loop. Now, the only way I could achieve that with like level 11 characters, I stripped them of all class abilities and all items. So they were all basically the same, similar to being like polymorphed. They kept their intelligence and charisma and wisdom. Everything else was just like civilianed out to 10, 10, 10 across the board. And I was like, that's it. That's what you've got. And what I always say is like watching my partially min-maxed Blood Hunter Barbarian player be like, where's my greatsword down low? And I've gone, you don't have it anymore. Well, I tried to rage. Doesn't work like that anymore. Was a bit like taking old Yeller out the back. But he was on board after the first time. He was like, okay, I understand what you're doing now. Let me just shake off my, I need a +8 to hit. Otherwise I'm not doing it properly just for 10 sessions. And then I can go back. Yeah. And I think had he had a greatsword in person in real life, he would have been hugging that thing as soon as they returned to the present time and just been like, So that was my thing, and how I approached it was just gave the players a lot of heads up and just said, it's gonna be weird, it's gonna be different. We'll try it. Hopefully, I've done a whole bunch of prep, so I'm hoping it should be quite enjoyable. And I always say that was for luck or talent, I don't know, but that is one of the ones they very much enjoyed. They continue to talk about it. It's one of the more memorable chapters that I think they'll remember for quite some time. In 20 years, and they're playing other games with other people in other parts of the world, and something similar happens. They go, "Oh yes, I played that back in the day. One of my old DMs did this time loop thing, and that makes me happy." So they, I know I asked that question about should you risk the unknown, but don't. I think you just you just got to try. I think the format of TTRPGs encourages that kind of play.
I feel like what you said that you had you knew it was going to be 10 sessions as well. I feel like having a time limit can be quite helpful. So an example I have is we wanted to try a new game, and I really wanted to try Wander Home, which is a lovely, lovely game, but very, very different. And we were going straight from D&D to Wander Home, which is quite a massive jump in style of play from traditional D&D to a story game, GM-less story game. And it was quite like we all have talked about it after, and we're like, that was quite like a crunchy start for us. We did struggle to kind of understand how to play it for probably about 3 or 4 sessions. But we also had decided ahead of time we're going to play about 8 sessions. And so kind of having that knowledge of like, okay, we're trying to get up to that point. By the last couple of sessions, it was actually really fun and we were getting more used to it. But it was kind of nice having that like safety net of, well, we're going to stop after this. So even if we don't like it, we know there's something else coming up afterwards.
I think with many things in life, having either a deadline or as you said, we're going to try this for X number of sessions. Just gives you that parachute out if you need to be like, you know what, that wasn't working. Let's stop it. Saying I planned 10 sessions is being more, favorable than actually happened.
But I was like, maybe contained.
I was like, maybe this should take them every loop. They should get this far, and then by that, I think it ended up taking them 12 in the end. But the nature of that, this is to my credit, the nature of that setting was there was quite an easy way to like ramp it up because like, oh, the time travel is destabilizing, so push, go. Like you've only got a certain number of loops left essentially, which was really like a kick up the backside, which helped it be 12 and not 15 sessions. But
it's making me think also, we were saying about like, this is obviously GM stuff, but player wise, I feel like sometimes having check-in points can be quite good for that. So like I'm playing in a game where the GM said, when you get to level 5, because we started at level 1, I'm going to do a check-in with you, and you can change some of your character stuff if
Mhm.
you need to, in case you've realised that you really don't like what you've made, which made it easier to be like, okay, I will try something a bit different. So again, like I feel like kind of the same idea of just building check-in points and like pause points to see if the experiment is working.
Absolutely, and that's a brilliant segue to one of the other things I wanted to say. We'll probably look back to GM stuff in a second, but
Yeah, for sure.
I find certainly with D&D and how crunchy it is and mechanical it is, and how much you have to lock in so early for like medium to long term campaigns, you have to lock in loads. Knowing that, I gave my players a level 3. Right, how's everyone doing? Are you happy with your racing
Yes.
class
Yep.
combinations? If not, we're just going to change and retcon, and no one's going to bat an eyelid, and we'll just go forward. I don't think anyone actually changed at that point. Probably level 5 is a better place to do it, if I was to say in hindsight, because level 3 you've only really got your subclass. Yeah. What am I? Yeah, of course, both is probably absolutely the right answer.
Both is good.
Yes, no changes until level 5. No, yeah.
Level 10 change.
But I find that, let's say, you are at level 10. Sometimes you can feel a bit stuck in a class when it comes to experimenting. Say you're halfway between level 6 and 7, for example. Again, in D&D's tiered system, you might not see when the next level up is coming. Certainly, if you're milestone based, you might not know. It might be 10 sessions, it might be 2 sessions. You might just be like, I don't know when the long rest is coming. Some classes can't change anything until a long rest. How do you feel like, how can players still experiment within those restrictions of like, well, I prepped invisibility, but I don't need it for the next week, so I guess I'm just stuck with a wasted spell. That's a very mechanical example, but a wider, the wider piece of like, I'm a wizard and I can't tank damage, but I want to be able to take a little bit of damage is probably another example. But how do you feel players can get a little bit of mileage in their own experimenting? Because we've just spent half an hour talking about how much the DM has all this power and tries this and can try that, and no one cares and no one minds.
Yeah, I feel like it is easier for the GM to do experimenting, and like I feel like it's a bit harder to experiment as a player a lot of the time, depending on like the game you're playing and things, because it can, as you say, it does lock you in. Again, like I feel like talking with the GM is always useful to be like, I want to try this, but then obviously they could say no, which as a player I'm like, how dare you say no? But as GM I'm like, of course I would say no. That thing's way overpowered.
Yes.
But yeah, I feel like you can do smaller like little things. Like you could always just do roleplay based little experiments and things first while you're waiting for mechanical ones. So I guess it is a bit more difficult for players. I'm not really sure how you get around mechanical like restrictions unless you just talk to the GM and we're like, can we get around this?
Yeah, it is. That is probably one of the downsides specifically of D&D 5e is that we're locked in. Again, caveats are for medium and long terms, one shots, who cares? Whatever, make whatever crazy character you want, try it, doesn't work, who cares? That was 4 hours, done, moving on. But for these medium and long, where you're trying to go from tier 1 to tier 2 to maybe even 3 and 4, maybe if you're part of the 2% of campaigns that do that. Or I mean, there's an easy out, is obviously character not being in the game anymore because they might die, or they might want to leave the adventuring party for whatever reason. That is one out, I guess, if I had to really think. Of course, a couple of my players had the easiest way, in that their characters unfortunately met a hero's end, shall we say, in the fight for justice, or in injustice.
I guess
perhaps.
one way that, at least as a player, I try and experiment is, I would say I am perhaps overly creative in my solutions to solving problems a lot of the time. But I'll always try and explain the rationale behind why I'm doing something like different from the norm. So, for example, say I wanted to try and use a spell in a weird way. I'll try and like explain my thought behind it rather than just being like, I try and do this. It's like, okay. So, for example, I wanted to try and use a ball of force at one point, I think, to trap an enemy in. And because we were like on a pier, I was like, what if I kind of trap them inside and like roll them off into the sea so that they just float away from us? But I don't know if a ball of force floats or not. So I was just like, I explained this. And we were like, yeah, okay, that makes sense. So I feel like, explaining your motivation behind why you're trying something is often quite a good idea to kind of get everyone on board a bit more, rather than just being like, I do this.
And again, that works both ways, just with the GM as well. Like, as I said earlier on, I was being like, here's the kind of thing I want you to play and want you to feel, because I think you'd get a lot of enjoyment out of it. It wasn't just you don't have any items anymore, deal with it.
Yes.
I think that made a hell of a difference. But that you've got my GM brain now working overdrive of what's the word for how much a medium can move through a filter, like how much air can get through a wall of force. My brain is now like, how many cubic gallons of air.
I think it might have been the bead of power force thing. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I was envisioning it very much like a yoga ball bouncing across the waves, but it didn't quite work like that.
It's like, my brain is my DM brain is now just, I love those. Well, I love and hate them with those really niche edge case. Like, never is this going to come up again. How does this one thing interact with this other thing that never the two should have ever met? And just being like, here we go. This is either 3 hours of discussion or 30 seconds of discussion, depending on the players. If we jump back then for a second to the GM side of things. So obviously we've talked about the setting. We've also talked a larger piece about mechanical things, rather than just you're now in the city or you're now out in the Wild West. Another piece of the DM's toolkit is homebrew stuff, which obviously we've touched upon quite heavily, and I think is a bit hand in hand with experimenting. But how do you approach homebrew? I'm such a hypocrite. I'm thinking ahead of what I'm going to tell you later, and I'm like, oh god damn, you're such a hypocrite. But how do you approach homebrew stuff and kind of integrate it into your setting, if that's any different to what we've already discussed?
Yeah. Well, how do we define homebrew? Because I feel like everyone defines it differently.
I love the academic counter
question. That
there.
Is my day job. Is that so? Like, I have to define my terms. But the reason I ask is I have one person who was like, oh yeah, anything that is not a pre-written scenario I view as homebrew, which I would disagree with. I would sort of view homebrew as sort of your own setting, adding in your own rules and things. But yeah, I know some people kind of vacillate between what they actually mean. But if we take it to mean like adding in your own rules and like going beyond the base like lore of the sort of settings of Faerun and so on, I do that all the time. Like, that's my favorite thing to do. So yeah, my view on homebrew, do lots of it. But also I feel like you don't have to like do it all at once. So as I said before, like I started small when I was planning campaigns and things by, okay, if we start in a small like town area and then expand out, it gives me the room to add in additional things as needed. So for example, that same campaign led to me writing one of my adventures, the Spire Top mystery one, where it's like a city of Aarakocra, and that just was me being like, what if Bird City? So like fun stuff can kind of come from experimenting and adding in homebrew elements. So yeah, that's my view on homebrew.
I am, anytime any of my players are like, oh, I found this thing online, especially when they're building characters and stuff many years ago, I was like, that's just on a wiki, that's going to be horribly wrong and imbalanced, and I thought sorcerer gets this.
Yes, disasters using online other people's homebrew.
Yeah, and someone's like, oh, but my sorcerer can do this, and I've gone, no, because that's a wiki from 3rd edition that somebody wrote when they were like drunk 20 years ago. So no, your sorcerer can't just fly for free. Oh, can't it? I'm like, no, use the book, man. And then on the other hand, I've just spent all this entire time talking about my entire homebrew campaign, which is all me making up this entire fantastical world of things happening. So that's the hypocrite in me is really doing double time today.
I feel like online other people's homebrew is kind of separate from your own a little bit, in that you have to take everything you see online with a bit of a pinch of salt and like double check it works. Because I one shot kills my wizard in like the second episode of my first ever campaign because I tried to use a homebrew monster and it was really overpowered. So I went, oh, that wasn't supposed to happen. And then everyone was very nice about it and we like reran the scene and I had used a normal monster stats instead and it was fine. But it was like, lesson learned, check it first that it makes sense.
I think that's the best, we can hope for, is that you learn. Like, I love how this discussion on experimenting has brought us to like learning from your mistakes and learning from doing and how to become better at this hobby. I just love that conversation has brought us there. So not only is one of the best ways to learn is to learn by doing, again, not for everybody, but one of the ways, and also from your mistakes. A friend of mine used to say at university, if he'd done something stupid 2 times in a row, he'd go, "You idiot! Even monkeys learn from their mistakes," implying that he's such a fool that he's making stupid mistakes the same over and over. Was that the definition of insanity? Is doing the same thing over again and expecting a different
results?
Yeah. So like just learning from those mistakes, and even at that time, having the wherewithal to say, let's just Doctor Strange that back a little bit and we'll take it a different route. I didn't mean to do that. Just fantastic.
Actually, the main lesson I learned from it was it's okay to tell my players I'd messed up on something, because before that I was like, I've got to be this all-powerful GM who knows everything. Like that's kind of the vibe you get if you watch a lot of those like how to GM YouTube videos. It's like, you are the god of the game. And it's like, no, I'm playing this game with my friends for fun and I didn't mean that to happen, so I'm just going to tell them, and then they're all nice about it and it was fine. So I feel like, another lesson I learned at the same time as don't trust homebrew on the internet was talk with your players and be like, your friends want to have a nice time with you and will be fine if you mess up.
As a twofer, as a one buy one get one free there. That's great. And I've one of my player characters who was quite pivotal in last night's game. He is a Twilight cleric now, which I think is mainly considered a bit OP because it's from the later books and designed better and is a bit overtuned for the cynic and me to sell books, but such is life. And I've said before, like, oh god, okay, you're just now like way better than you were before. And he said, he's messaged me privately and said, if you want to have a talk about toning anything down or tweaking a few bits out of the book. And I've said, no, I got to live by the sword and die by the sword. If I'm only allowing pure stuff from the books, I gotta only allow stuff from the books. I gotta trust that it's gonna be okay. And that's how I dealt with it. But I'm very fortunate that player came and said, even I can see that I'm overtuned a little bit compared to the rest of my party. Do you want to fandangle a few things? I'm like, nah, I trust you. You're good. We'll just make it work together. I think meeting in the middle is probably 90% of the work, and then the rest is just the magic that happens when you roll the dice. That's the soundbite. That's the soundbite for today's episode. One of the many. So we've talked. Well, certainly what I wanted to talk about from the GM's point of view, and we've had some great nuggets of wisdom in there that I frankly was not expecting to reach, but I'm very glad we did. And we've also talked about the player side of thing. So we can loop back around to what you said at the beginning then around different systems. And one thing that I hadn't thought of that you mentioned is bringing in elements from different systems or different frameworks into your existing games. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So this is mostly from my own experience of doing this and finding it very helpful. So like my little ttrpg GM journey was start with GMing D&D, hop to Wander Home, which was a big change, but also trying things like Powered by the Apocalypse games, which are like kind of somewhere in the middle. And then after I tried what we would call like story games, narrative driven games, I went all the way over to OSR, old school rule games like Mausritter and Mothership and MÖRK BORG and things. And I still play all of them. So currently I'm running a D&D game, a Glitter Hearts game, and I was just running a Mausritter game. But what I've done is, as I've gone through, I picked up the things I like from each of them, and then I bring them into my other games. So, for example, I really like writing random tables now, which is something I picked up from old school rules games to invite like randomness into the game. So I'll write like, rather than it just being treasure tables or encounter tables, I'll write like little fun scenes that can happen as encounters. So for example, in our Eberron game, when we go to a new city, because part of our thing is all about exploring, I'll like write a little encounter table for people they might meet. based on the current city they're in. And then instead of being like, okay, I plan out exactly what you're going to do, if it gets to a lull where they're kind of, say, looking around or something, I'll be like, oh, so-and-so roll a d6. Oh, okay, you may X person. And then we do a little thing based on that and see where it goes, to just add that sort of more, kind of loosen up the game structure a little bit compared to like traditional D&D. Or like the other thing I do is I'll bring in sort of elements of, instead of doing a hard and fast pass or fail roll on a D20 roll, I might be like, roll it and then we'll see how well you did on something. And that's something I picked up from playing Powered by the Apocalypse games, which have a mixed success as part of their results. It's not just pass or fail, there's also partial success. So that's kind of what I mean by bringing in like stuff from other games, is like, if you see something that seems cool, you can always just like incorporate it a little bit into how you play other games as well, just for fun, basically.
Consider me convinced, because I have been maybe staunchly not against roll tables, but I personally never saw. Maybe it's the control freak in me.
I used to really not like them, and now I love them.
Yeah, so I've begun that journey thanks to you, because I never really saw. It's the control freak in me. It's like, well, why leave it up, because then I've got more things to plan and stuff. And I was going to say, like, how do you use that in the game when they're doing stuff? But you answered it expertly through your definition of saying when it reaches a lull and you need to kind of zhuzh it up a little bit. And that was the bit for me that I was like, how many times have I been in that situation? And of course, just sat behind the screen like, this is exactly as I've planned. And in reality, in my head going, oh God, do something, please, players. This is why is nothing happening?
The big switch for me was because, I was very like you. I had the thing of like, I want to control what's happening so I can be prepared. And I think it's because I was always seeing it as other people had written the roll table. And it was like, well, that's not appropriate to the thing I'm running. But the answer is write your own roll table that matches like what you're doing. So like, for example, my partner ran a really fun game of liminal horror recently, which is like a cool horror system. And so it doesn't do like the classic horror thing of like, ooh, psychic stress. It does what's called like burdens or fallout, where just something happens to you that you then have to kind of deal with. And it said in the rules, rewrite these to the thing you're doing to kind of make it fit with the setting. So it's it's more personalized to your game. And then it also means if you write it yourself, you can always save it for later and use it, recycle it if it doesn't get used, which is quite nice.
So I imagine you'd re-roll if you were using the table again and you hit the same answer. You re-roll it, So consider me a novitiate in this this roll tables, thanks to yourself. I might think about introducing a few of those to the next few chapters, the next few major cities and stuff they go to bring in those elements of like, it's not always primary path, primary objective, go.
Also, you actually don't actually need to roll on it. You can just look at it and be like, which one would be the interestingest right now? Oh, that one. Okay, let's do that one. Like, you can roll if you want, but you could just be like, oh, that one seems cool.
My programmatic mindset, I'm now slowly realizing, has hindered me so much in these. Roll tables should be rolled on.
I think this was the conclusion we came to last time when we were talking about using Pinterest, and you were like, I've never thought of this before. And I'm like, yes, expand your mind with the weird left brain thinkers.
This is why I do the show. This is to steal ideas. This is my secret sauce. I'm trying to think now whether I have done. I mean, inadvertently, yes, like everything is, derivative to a certain extent. So things I've seen or felt, I've probably heard or read somewhere else before, and it's buried its way down in my subconscious, and I've regurgitated it at a later date. So I love, what was it, mixed success, partial tiered success, whatever.
Yes.
There's a term and it escapes me. But that one it just makes sense to me. Having a binary pass or fail kind of makes sense at lower levels, but as soon as you get to higher levels, it kind of sucks to be an expert at something and out objectively fail at a task you should be an expert in. So bringing in that sliding scale, that makes it a tiny little bit more overhead on the GM, but otherwise a lot more fun. So that I absolutely use. Is that I'm trying to think if that's in any of the the 3 core D&D books, or if that is.
No, it's not a D&D thing. However, one D&D thing that people kind of play around with, I think inadvertently, depending on how they've learned, is like some of the books say like, oh well, if someone would be good at this thing, they can just do it, and that is more of an old style of play that then gets reincorporated back into new school games. But that's something that like you can kind of change depending on how you tend to do your roles. So for example, I used to be like, okay, right, well, you said you're going to jump, so it's time for you to do an athletics check. But it's like, oh, but you are actually like very skilled at this, so I think you could probably do this without having to do it as a role. Oh, but now you're doing something, the same thing, but it's risky. That makes it more interesting if you roll. So that's it. Again, that mindset is something I've kind of brought in from playing a variety of different games and kind of, just experimented with how I apply some of the general checks and rules. So yeah, that's one way to do it.
Yeah, I think a lot of it also comes from experience and by doing, and the more you run games and playing games, obviously, because the same can be said for players in terms of, all that didn't work in the last encounter, let me tweak my, or next level up, I'll take that feat instead to round it out. Same can be said for both kinds of players. But for GMs, I think after you've played run X hours of sessions, you quickly fall into your own unique rhythm of, we do binary at this, success and fail for ability checks at this table. That's just, I think it's quicker and easier, and for everything has pros and cons, and that's fine and cool, but you need to get those hours under your belt to fall into that rhythm of like, oh, okay, I know what works for me and the players, that's what we're gonna go with. And then once you've hit that, that comfortable point, then you can bring in like, ooh, why don't we dabble in some weird things, like a natural 20 isn't always a success, maybe. Let's try something else.
Let's do a luck roll. Although I also think you can then, it can be quite good to kind of then get to the other side of that. So like have an experimental phase and then be like, okay, what happens if I do follow the rules exactly as written? How does it change it? And like, this is kind of the game designer side of me coming out, but I think it can be fun to like deliberately try and stick to the rules as close as possible to see what was the intended result of like why something is done that way. So for example, in OSR games, because they're designed to be usually quite like lethal, high lethality, it's like, don't fudge those rolls, don't try and change how easy it is to do something, because it's kind of supposed to be quite difficult. But then the caveat is that the way you're supposed to play with that is not rolling very often, which wouldn't work so well in D&D. So like, I think it can be really good to experiment, but then be like, why am I experimenting? Kind of, again, as we were saying, like factoring that knowledge back into how you're doing it. If you want to be doing that, of course, I'm someone who is always wanting to kind of improve how I play. But as if you're happy doing it the way you're doing it, that's fine. But I think it can be good to also be like, okay, well, why is it like this?
Yeah, no, I'm a huge proponent of like design intent. I call it like, why have they said this thing works in this way, or why have they used that specific terminology? And certainly for spells, the bread and butter, one of the few things that's changed the least throughout every edition. That the wording is very precise and it's had decades and decades of refinement. And I don't want to mess with that stuff too much, because I'm like, decades of refinement and hundreds of people have reviewed that and said this is the specific way it should work, and I'm keen on like, player, that thing you're trying to do probably won't work in that way, but here's why, rather than just saying like no or yes, equally yes. You say, okay, but here's why it doesn't work that way, because that's really meant to be the purpose of that is designed and built and balanced in such a way that it's used for area of denial, and you're trying to use it to like set a house on fire, which a poor example, but you know what I mean, like
I know what you mean, like, no, this thing is actually meant for this other spell which you don't have but you could get.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, that is precisely. It's like, hey, you've kind of picked your path this way, and it's, say, elemental, fire damage. If you want to start illusioning and stuff, then we come back to that checkpoint, as you said earlier on, and say like, hey, is that actually really where your heart lies? And we can rejig things. But the design intent of fire spells isn't to scare people, it's to burn people.
I feel like D&D spells in particular are written in that way where you see like a sign that has something really specific that it tells you not to do, and you're like, someone did that. And that's why that's so it's like the wording on this is so precise. It's because someone has messed around with this. Whereas, again, interestingly, experimenting wise, like some other games are very loose in how they describe their spells. Like they'll just be like, "This is a fire spell. Go forth and do what you want." Which, experimenting with both, you might realize, no, I like the preciseness of the D&D spells, or no, I like the openness of the other one.
Yeah. I wanted to ask then, because you've had such a vast experience in different systems, and one thing to my detriment is I've not played the older editions like OGL and stuff. And I want to ask how different is it in reality? Because obviously I've heard a lot of online discourse that obviously kind of paints it typically in a negative light. But how different is it when you actually come down to playing? Because that's really what matters to me. And then secondly, off the back of that design intent discussion, are there quite clear threads from like back then? Can you kind of see, I know it's the OGL stuff has been updated to, you know, modern day stuff, but can you kind of see where the timeline, almost like cutting a tree and seeing the rings through the tree?
Yeah. So I have to say it's not my area of expertise because I haven't played original Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, but I have like obviously looked a little bit at that sort of stuff. But the stuff I play is more in general is the stuff that is attempting to recreate the feel of that, but with updated, more modern, like streamlined systems. So, for example, Into the Odd is a good example where they've Chris McDowell has tried to make it as slimline as possible, but still get that feel of like fast exploration, creative play, and things like that. But to be honest, of the ones I have played, so Into the Odd and Mausritter and things like that, I would say that my general style doesn't change too much while playing it, because actually the things that my players like are still the same. And so we're still leaning into that. And my desire to make everything cute has stayed the same. But also, it's like, depending on what opportunities and encounters and things you put forward, you can actually play it in much the same way as D&D if you wanted to. You could make a game that just completely smashes everyone flat immediately, like MÖRK BORG, and just like kill character after character after character. But you don't have to, even though the rules are there to make it like that. My players, when we played, for example, Mausritter, none of them died, but it's because I was very good at like foreshadowing the dangers, and they were then cautious about it. So we knew we were playing a game where they were trying not to die. But I didn't change the rules to do that. That was how they played. So so in terms of, to answer your question about like threads through, there's some threads that I think are the same. One of which is that creative problem solving. So like I feel like most people when playing at least quite enjoy finding an interesting solution to problems, be they actual puzzles and riddles or just like encounters with people or combat encounters. And I think that has kind of come through as a thread throughout. And also for D&D, at least, obviously that combat being a focus is another thing that has kind of stayed throughout. But yeah, you can play them pretty similarly, to be honest, if you want to. Or you can make them very different depending on what you lean into. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So one final question I had for yourself then is, people, including myself, are sometimes reticent to experiment with different systems because of the overhead.
Yes.
Because of the overhead, and partly because there is a little bit of stepping outside my comfort zone. And I appreciate the irony of that, in that everybody stepped outside their comfort zone to even start playing D&D, for example. But how did, like, obviously you've tried a number of different systems. And the example you gave earlier on about, we gave ourselves a defined time limit of like 10 sessions in this new system. But how do you deal with that initial overhead of somebody? Usually it falls onto one person to kind of start to learn the system and the rules, and then to disseminate that between the rest of the players. But how do you deal with stepping outside your comfort zone and that initial knowledge overhead of trying to learn new stuff?
Yeah. Well, it's definitely something that I think about a lot, because I think it's very easy for someone like myself who's played a lot to be like, oh, it's so easy to learn new games. No, it's not. It is actually quite difficult, especially the first time you're learning a new game. It does get easier over time because you start to see patterns in like different games and things. But yeah, when I was first like, oh, I might try something a bit different, it was like, oh my gosh, but all my players already own all the books for D&D, and it's so much easier to learn D&D because there's all these resources available. So I think one of it's like the main ways I kind of approach it for myself is, firstly, actually a lot of games are not as expensive as D&D, which is quite helpful. And also, instead of being like, okay, I need to watch Matt Colville teach me how to GM for 20 YouTube episodes, it's like I could probably watch an actual play of someone playing the system I want to play, so that'll be a bit faster. And then, okay, if I skip to the most important parts in the book first and speed up the learning style, I can break down how fast it takes to learn something. So like using kind of study tricks and things kind of reduces that load of having to learn stuff. But the other thing is, I think, is, yeah, there's definitely this feeling of, oh, well, the GM needs to go away and learn everything immediately. But you could always be like, I'll learn most of it, but we'll also learn as we play a little bit and like read most of the book, but also like get started and see how it goes and have everyone learn together can work. But yeah, I think, well, I'm sure you had this experience where sometimes I think you might want to try something or someone wants to try something, but no one really wants to take the lead on jumping in. I think I've definitely kind of felt like, oh well, I'll have to do it as GM, and then I don't get to play it, which is quite annoying.
that exactly happened to me because I picked up the Alien RPG start set and then was like, why did I do that? Because I actually want to play this. I don't want to run.
Yes.
So I a friend of mine I've played D&D with before. I was like, here's the box. You like, if he offered and just force it upon him. But I was like, okay, if you want to, you can just take the box, you can learn, and then I'm happy at some point to run later on. But I'd like to play first, which I think, did I run? I'm trying to remember back now if the very first D&D game I played in, or I think I was a player in my first D&D game, which I guess is probably a better way to try. But no, yeah, absolutely. I found myself in that precise situation of like, okay, well now I've got this box that I don't want to read half of because I want to be a player and I just want to turn up and enjoy it. That's the lazy person in me, of course, talking.
I mean, the super secret option is teach all your friends how to GM and then take it in turns. Yes. But that only works if your friends want to GM. So
yes, yeah. Is there anything you want to talk about that we haven't quite got to yet?
No, I think actually that's probably most of it. Oh, actually, one area I was thinking about was like style of play is something you can experiment with. So, for example, if we talk about trad style, it's like, okay, we're going to have at least one combat encounter and then we're going to go and do this and so on. But some people experiment a lot with like mostly social based sort of games or intrigue or mystery. But that can be kind of, at least from my experience, it was interesting learning to do that for the first time because obviously there's less sort of support for that in the books, although there is lots of stuff online to help learning how to try those different styles. So yeah, I didn't know if you tried anything like that as well.
I have reflected so poorly on this episode because this is another example of my contradiction in terms. As I said, I'm very much, rules is written, book, design intent.
Yeah.
But then I'll have a session where the first 3 hours no one rolls a dice because it is just talking and fluff and moving and that kind of stuff. And that thought of rolling a dice never enters my brain.
Yeah. You're just having fun.
So absolutely, just from part of that, finding my DM groove and not having to feel like I roll for everything all the time. A lot of stuff just happens. I'm very much slowly abandoning the clutching exposition and knowledge to my chest, like the sneaky DM I am. I'm very much trying to be more like, no, just give them the knowledge, and that speeds things up and makes them feel clever and more powerful. That is still a learning process for me, a harder bridge to cross for me. But yes, I've inadvertently experimented with bending those rules just from sake of how that session has ended up. And sometimes, we'll get to like 20 minutes before the end. I'm like, hang on, guys, I haven't said, can you roll me this tonight at all? Is this the first one of the game? And then we'll be like, oh god, yeah, I think it is. Which I know is like abhorrent to the old guard, and everybody should be rolling. And if you're not rolling, you're not in danger, and stuff like that. But
I sometimes do the opposite, where I'm like, I'm going to make you roll for something really innocuous, like how was your coffee this morning? And just be like, yeah, well, how was that croissant you bought from the Goblin Bakery? Oh, it was pretty good. Okay.
you can't have your I like cutesy and everything's cute and then be the most Machiavellian DM ever, making them roll for their morning coffee is
Well, the nat 1 would be like you spilt it everywhere. But the 20 is just like, wow, you've got an extra pep in your step. Like, it's just very low stakes.
No, poison. Always poison. Well, awesome. Well, I think that pretty much brings us to the end of today's discussion. Then, is there anything you would like to promote?
Yes. Well, I write some of my own games and also adventures for games. So if the lovely listeners want to check any of those out, those are over on my itch.io and on Drive-Thru RPG. And then I have some D&D ones as well on DM's Guild, which you said we're going to pop some links in the description. But you can find me everywhere at Philippa Mort or at Mort Philippa as a tag. So if you wanted to look up any of those, you can do. But in particular, I've been writing and finishing up a Mausritter adventure, which is called Mycelium, which is about a garden overrun by these mushroom men and fairies trying to set up a fairy outpost to take over the local mouse villages. As I say, I like cute things, but it's a very fun game if you wanted to try a different game. So that's something I've been working on at the moment. So another thing that I've been up to at the moment is I'm on 2 streams. One is with D8 Dungeon. We are playing random DMs where we play through Lost Mines of Phandelver, but we play every fortnight, and at the end of the session we roll to see who's going to be DMing the next session. Which is about as chaotic as you can imagine. And then the other one I'm doing at the moment is I'm running a Glitter Hearts campaign on Girls Run These Worlds, which is inspired by H2O, just add water. So we have magical mermaids investigating mysteries, and that's called Touch the Ocean, because that's the name I thought was H2O subtitle when I had forgotten what it was called. And that's going to be live on Mondays, but also it's going to be on YouTube afterwards. So you might want to check that out if you fancy.
Mondays, what time are we talking? And of course, what time zone as well?
UK time, it starts at 7. And for random DMs, it's on Thursdays and starts at 8.
Well, one of my precious few British guests, so I've got.
Yes.
So yes, all the episodes, all the links will be in the episode description, of course. So the only thing left to say is thank you ever so much for your chat today, Philippa.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed yourself. I had a lot of fun. It's always fun. You bring an infectious, cute energy, which my hardline DM edge it lacks sometimes. So
let everyone do everything fun.
it's a perfect.
That sounds cool. Yeah, do it. Is frequently said.
So yes, thank you again. Thanks to everyone for listening at home. Please go and check out all the Philippa's stuff. It's all in the episode description, easily at hand. Otherwise, thank you all for listening and good night. Now it's time for the Patreon shout-outs. Huge thank you to all my patrons, starting with Josh, Lewanika and Glenn, the 3 fabulous hosts of Tabletop Journeys who've been on the show several times before and who I'll always invite back. So go check out Tabletop Journeys at ttjourneys.com or at ttjourneys on Twitter. We also have Joe from the Fourth Leg podcast all about giving DMs another leg to stand on. Again, previous guests of the show, and I'd thoroughly encourage you to go and check out their great content. So you can find them at the Fourth Leg on Twitter. We have a good friend of the show, Optional Rule. You can go and find him out on optionalrule.com or at Optional Rule, full of very insightful and educated comments and thoughts and threads on the really nitty-gritty of D&D. We have, what a guy, Matthew Perkins, who is just out there in the world trying to make you laugh. So go and check him out at matthewperkins.net or at Hey It's Matty P, Mattyp. And good friend of the show and one of my table mates, Matthew Street. Go and check out his partner's hustle at virtualtimehustle.com or at mpstreet88 on Twitter.